kick off our presentation today.
Thank you, Levon. Thank you for everyone for coming. I hope that I have a rich set of examples here from the field. You know that that getting a PhD means teaching and research. I lean toward the research side. I love field work and used most of my time as a anthropologist in the field internationally and domestically. The way I figured out I wanted to be an anthropologist was I was first a teacher. After my undergraduate work, I taught for 12 years, first elementary school and then secondary science, and loved teaching, but knew I didn't want to do it for the rest of my life. And I went on a tourist trip to Africa, and I was in a hotel in Africa, and we were going on all of these guided tours and everything, and we saw the palace, and we saw the university, and we saw a lot of people who spoke to us, some of whom had gone to the university in the States and all that. But in my hotel room, twice during my stay there, I looked out the window and looked down in the alley where I saw this twice, 2 days, maybe not in a row, but 2 days, that a maid who worked in the hotel came out into the alley, and a child, a teenager probably, came with a baby on her back, and the maid nursed the baby. And I said, it's wonderful to know about the professors and all of the civil servants that we've had on the tour, but I want to know about that lady. I want to know how she lives. How does she organize her household so that the baby nurses exactly when she has time off and the teenager is there to, I said, that's what I want to know about. So that's how I came to anthropology and decided to go to graduate school and study it. Anthropology has 4 fields: sociocultural anthropology, anthropological linguistics, archaeology, and physical biological anthropology. But the applied part is you take all of those and you apply them to human issues, to societal issues and problems. So I did the applied work by doing a lot of field work. You've also heard the word ethnography in the intro. Ethnography is a long-term, detailed study. You go in the field and you take copious notes. It results in qualitative data, not quantitative, although you can do surveys and get statistical data. So most of this is done with ethnography. You get firsthand experiences in the community. You participate in the community. It becomes your community, and that's why I can talk about these as my communities. When you don't have enough time or perhaps funding, you can do snapshots of ethnography, and that's what we did in one setting. Okay, I'm going to screen share now, and hopefully share. There it is. Okay, so that's the beginning slide, which you've already seen, and that's the beginning. To get to the next, here we are. Okay, I already talked about anthropology having 4 fields. It's holistic, cross-cultural, applied. It has traditions of long-term study. I talked about ethnography, and if you don't have time to do full ethnography, you can do snapshots. The settings I'm going to talk about are probably 4. Abi, which is a village in Togo, in West Africa. I'll show you a map of Togo. There's Noache, which is a town in Togo where I lived for a year. Also, in this country, Tunica County, Mississippi. I'll show you where that is on a map. And I might get into 4 projects in 4 other states in the United States. Most of my urban projects were school projects, and if I have time, I'll talk about those too. Okay, Togo. This is where I spent a lot of time. I did 2 studies in Togo. This is a map of Africa, and you can see that Togo is a little sliver of a country in West Africa. On the west side is Ghana, and on the east side is Benin. So that's where Togo is. The other place I'm going to talk about is Tunica, Mississippi. Tunica is a county in the far northwestern part of Mississippi. You can see how close it is to Memphis. It's just 20 some miles out of Memphis, Tennessee. And if the map went a little farther in Arkansas, you could see Little Rock, Arkansas. So those are the other project states I've worked in, Michigan, New York, Missouri, Louisiana, that I might get to given the time. Okay, this is a project that I did, a 2-month project in a village in Togo. This is a village that was, because this was several decades ago, all of this work that I'm going to present goes from the 80s all the way to 2011, so it's history. But they had no access to clean water. This is the entrance to the village. You go to the village, you sit on that kind of seat leaning on the tree, and you talk. You ask the chief if you can come and work in the village. This is the chief, and he said yes. And so we brought the gifts that you give a chief, and I had an assistant working with me. And this village is about 3 miles from a main road. So you have to walk the main road. Okay, one ethnographic technique I used is shadowing. I wanted to know the water situation, and this lady allowed me to shadow. She was going to get water, and she allowed me to shadow her for the day, and it took most of her day to go and get water. She got water from this polluted pond that was about 3/4 of a mile from the village. So this was the injustice here was no access to clean water. Before I go to that one, the problem here was guinea worm. Guinea worm is an insidious disease that you get from drinking polluted water. It's a parasite that gets within you. Sorry if you're squeamish, but it gets within you. It goes through a pupa and a larva stage, and it pops out through your skin as a worm. You can't dig it out because you'll have to dig out the whole muscle. You can't cut it off because then it would go back in. So you have to, over a year, let this worm come out. This is what happened from drinking this water. If you boil the water, it would get rid of the parasite, but in this poor village, they didn't have enough water. They didn't have enough wood, enough fuel to boil water and cook their food. So this was easy to write up because that's such an insidious disease and everybody had it. And so the report I wrote went to local officials and to my department in the university that water was needed here. This was fresh water somehow was needed here. It was easy to write, easy to persuade. And when I went back here in 4 years, they had dug wells. Now the women had to walk further than they did at this pond to go to the well, but they had to put the well so that several villages could use the well, and thus they had clean water. And I do have to mention the Jimmy Carter Foundation for eradication of guinea worm, because that was one of the kinds of funding they got. Most people know Jimmy Carter from his work in Habitat for Humanity, but his foundation has a special unit that tries to bring justice, environmental justice to Africa, and guinea worm eradication is one of them. Okay, now this is another town. This is the town of Moache, here again in Togo. This is a town that the water situation was taken care of, because you can see on the left the women lining up at a pump. Sorry, I didn't get the pump in the picture, but the people coming down the street. They finally had a water project here, clean water from a pump that you can go and just get if you can carry the water on your head. So you can see the situation was the water situation was pretty good here. This is the same town, and you can see in the distance the water tower. They built a water dam. They filtered the water and purified it, and the water from that tower goes into the pumps. So lack of access to clean water was the justice issue here. The reason I picked this town was because now that issue the guinea worm was eradicated, and I started to look at other issues. This is the town's leadership. The person in the suit is the district commissioner, and the person with the crown is the chief. There's the traditional government, the chief, and also the national government. This chief was the one who told me the most about having guinea worm as a child all your life. And once the worm came out, you were happy, but then you don't know if you've already drank water and had another one within you. So since the water was clean here, I was looking at the development. As you can see, there are electric lines. As soon as they put the water project in, they put the electricity too, so people had access to electricity. So I started looking at other issues, and I noticed that girls' education was an issue. Now, school is mandatory, but it requires school fees, and students can go to school until they stop passing the tests. So supposedly you're supposed to send all your children to school, but people don't. When there are fees, some people don't have the money to send their children to school. This was a family with, as you can see, 5 boys, but happy to have one girl who was the next to the youngest. The father is a civil servant. He had a job in the court, clerk of court, I believe. And they were sending all of their boys to school, but they were wondering about the girl. And so I started looking at how girls worked around the house, did a lot of the household chores. Women, of course, so that's necessary because they need to know how to keep a household because they can get a good husband. So the boys are usually sent to school. The girls stop sometimes in elementary school. But they were surprised that this girl passed the test out of elementary school to go to middle school. And I kind of figured out why. If you look at this picture, look on the right. That is a puzzle I had given to the family. And the boys worked on it and worked on it and worked on it. And the girl was not in that, but she was in that environment. And I figured out that even though they didn't expect her to do well in school, she was in this environment where her brothers were always talking about things, debating things, and she was picking up things from them, this yearning to learn. So what I did in this case was plant little seeds. And I did that by giving puzzles and games to families. Now, you couldn't just give it to the girls, you had to give it to the parents. So, but I knew they would give it to the boys, but just to get girls in this milieu of doing puzzles and thinking about things. So I did this exercise called planting seeds. And when I wrote it up, I had a whole list of seeds I had planted, giving out puzzles, giving out books to families, hoping that the girls got to use them. And so I knew I wasn't going to change the culture a lot, but planting seeds that might lead to changing the culture or having people think about girls' education. There was a high school, a regional high school in this town, and there were 175 students in the high school. Only 9 of them were girls. 9 girls out of 175. Most of the girls were, their parents were civil servants, so they had good jobs and they went to school. There were also some religious school. There was a Catholic school too, but here again, mostly boys. So girls were really disenfranchised from the education system. And this family was surprised that their daughter passed the test to go to middle school. They decided they would send her. So this planting of little seeds hopefully gave them a chance gave the girls a chance to do things other than being occupied with their household duties. Now, the community circumvents some of the rules here. Sometimes somebody doesn't pass and they are supposed to drop out, but they go to another school in the town and everybody kind of knows it. Another thing that was positive for girls' education here was that there was a law that any man who impregnates a schoolgirl, a girl who's still in school, gets jail time. Here again, like all laws everywhere, not always followed, but that showed that in Togo, they were getting on the bandwagon with educating girls. So I had a whole list, in writing this up, I had a whole list of seeds that I planted. Now, another planting of seeds was this one. Now, the girl receiving communion there is not the person I'm going to talk about. She was a person on my compound that lived on my compound, and she went to classes, and it was time for her to receive her first communion. But I was in the church visiting with her because she was receiving her communion, but I was looking at a boy who I had seen around town, and everyone told me he didn't go to school because he was disabled. He was very disabled. He walked with a stick like a crutch, but it was a branch. And he really had to maneuver his body almost 45 angle degrees just to take a step. But I noticed that he was always around town listening to men in circles of men outside of the circle listening. And the day we walked to this church, we had to march there, and he marched with us from the beginning, and we had to pass his house. And I said, well, it seems like he would start at his house, but he wanted to march from the beginning. So that made me think that he was probably curious and wanted to participate. Then the final thing in this church service, he sat down and tried to get his cane and his legs in a place where he could fit. And we sang a song, and he began to sing the harmony instead of the melody. And that made me think, there's cognitive food there that needs to be tapped. So I started planting seeds about disabled people. And I had a whole list of things that people I talked to the principal of the school. He said, no, we can't accommodate anybody like that. Look at him, he can't. And I tried to talk up, but he might want to come. He might want to. Anyway, the end of it, don't know exactly what happened, but they told me what would happen with him was he wouldn't be able to go to school, but somebody might take him on as, if he can work with his hands, he would get an apprenticeship with a weaver or something like that. Okay, so planting seeds is one of the ways that I used not to change the society, but to try to address injustice that as I saw it. Okay, this is one of the paved roads, and this is an example of a prejudice that I noticed, and this is a bit complicated, so I'm going to kind of tell it in three parts. This again is a town. You can see there are electric wires, electric poles, and far in the distance there's a water tower. Okay, so the way this example of being disenfranchised or prejudice came about was I walked around the town, and one of the things I had to do was map the town, and one of the ways I did this was to walk, just let people see me walking. So my assistant and I were walking around the town all the time, so I would map out the town. He wanted to improve his English, so he spoke to me in English. I wanted to improve my French, so I spoke to him in French. So he had a booming voice, and so he was always, people heard him speak to me in English. Um, the next part of the story is that one day I was in not a, it was like a Hotel 6 where there are cabins all together, but I was renting that before I rented a house. And there was a knock on my door, and I answered it in French, and somebody answered me in English, and she said, I'm a Peace Corps volunteer, and I heard that you were a researcher in the town, and wanted to just touch base with you. So I opened the door, and of course, I started in English. I said, hi. And as I opened the door, I saw this young white woman, which most of the Peace Corps volunteers were, and she stepped back and she said, oh. Now, to some extent, Black people are used to people not expecting them to be Black. And so I kind of said, that's probably it. But we did become friends, and she introduced me to other Peace Corps volunteers. And we became friends and met together quite often. Now, the last part of the story is that I wanted to do a case study of a woman and shadow her, and I wanted to do a particular woman because she spoke English, and I didn't have to have my translator there to help me or anything. And the interviews and focus groups, just woman to woman, were different than when a man was in the mix. So I said, let me do a case study of this woman. She told me she was from Ghana. A man had brought her there and set her up in this house, but he never gave her the money to start her business. And she doesn't know where he is now. And so we met a couple of times. Well, the people on my compound told me, don't ever be with her. Don't talk to that woman. Don't be seen with her because she's a prostitute. So I don't know if she was or not, because she was left there and she didn't have any money. So then the very last part of the story is that one day the Peace Corps volunteers and I were having a little party for people going away. And I had a chance to ask them, well, why was you so surprised to see me when you first met me? And you said, oh. And they told me they had seen me walking around with my assistant speaking English to me, and they said they knew that I was a prostitute from Ghana. The way I wrote that up
I'm sorry.
was that, who said that? The way I wrote that up is that here are my fellow Americans, my countrymen, my countrywomen, being corrupted by the local prejudices, superstitions, whatever they were, and making the assumption that every Black woman who spoke English was a prostitute from Ghana. And I talked to them about that. They always tell you, don't go native, don't take on the values of the country you're in. But it was just an example of an injustice done to me by my fellow country people in a situation where that was the local prejudice about Black women who spoke English. And I didn't have a chance to really drill down. There's a way you can drill down and figure out, why is this happening? Why are they saying this? Didn't have a chance, but that was an example of an injustice to me. Now, I want to go on to one time when I accepted the local customs and beliefs. And that was that when I was in my house, I couldn't sweep or do certain things. The people on my compound would send the children in to sweep and would not let me do housework, in other words. And to tell you the truth, since I was 5, I'd been washing the dishes, and I learned to mop the floor when I was 9. So I didn't think I would hire anybody to do things like that. But here's what they told me that made me accept their culture. If educated people do the work of their education and they do the work of other people that don't have education, then how are the people who don't have education going to live? They have to do the work that they can do. Educated people do the work they do. Therefore, I started hiring. Of course, I had already hired a girl to carry my water since I couldn't do that. But sweeping and washing clothes and things like that, I had to accept their way of thinking because that was kind of true. I was there. I had a Fulbright fellowship. So I had money for room and board and lots of other things. And there were a lot of people around me who really couldn't do any other work but sweep the floor or work in the marketplace. So I wrote that up as my learning, my accepting of the local values. Now, I want to go to other writers who've talked about this situation. Now, and I'll put this in the chat when you're writing. There's David Marantz, who wrote a book called African Friends and Money Matters in 2015. This same thing that was going on with me, he wrote it as a different fundamental thinking, and thus differences in behavior between Western people and African people. He said the economic systems are different, and therefore we think differently about who does what, who the class differences, who has servants and who doesn't have servants, and he wrote it like that. There's also an author named James Ferguson who wrote the book Give a Man a Fish. And the way he wrote it was different. What he said was that local people, and he was doing ethnography in both Africa and the Caribbean, he said local people look for streams of money. It might be somebody who has a business that's going well in the marketplace and they're making money, or it might be the old widow that lives way down there and she's living on her husband's pension. But they look for these streams of money and they tap into them so that they can live their lives through other people's streams. Do you see the difference? That's a very, I think, insidious way to talk about it. That writing that it's kind of will trick you into getting your money. Whereas the other author, David Marantz, talks about the fundamental differences in how people think about the economy. So that lesson is to be careful how you write something. Be careful how you say it and what kind of slant you're putting on it. I put a slant that said it was my learning. African Friends and Money Matters puts a slant on it that says we think differently. And the Give a Man a Fish book put the onus on the poor behavior on the local people, that they were trying to trick you into getting money. Okay, let's see where I am in my time.
You're fine. You're at 6:41. You're doing fine.
Great. I'm going to go, let's see the next one. Yes, I'm going to go to one of my, before I go to Tunica, Mississippi, I'm going to go to one of my projects in an urban area of one of these states. And I'm being kind of cryptic about this because some of the findings are not very positive, and I don't want to identify something. But let me tell you, one of these states, so I worked in the largest city. It wasn't the capital city, but it was the largest city in the state. And there were a couple of dozen high schools there. And I was documenting a community. And this high school was in the community. It was the um, second largest high school in the community. And having been a science teacher before, I was looking at the science projects. Now, they had a citywide science fair every year. Every school was supposed to have an entry. And I was talking to the department head of science who had been there a couple of years. And here's an example of how you really have to drill down in your look at communities and you look at injustice, because I jumped to a conclusion. I looked at the science projects that the students in this high school were putting in the science fair. I asked the department head, are they going to work on these? And she said, no, those are pretty much finished. We're taking them tomorrow. So as a former teacher, I had some science teacher, I had some expertise. And I said to myself, those are what I would expect of my elementary school students. And I took the notes in that way that the science projects were very elementary, rudimentary. And when I went back and I questioned her about it, and they had taken them on to the science fair, here's the way you start drilling down. I asked why they were of that level, and she said, number one, we're the second largest high school, and we have never ever entered, even though all schools are supposed to enter every year, we've never entered. This is our first entry. She took me to the statistics of the science test in that high school. And when she got there previously, 9.83% of the students had passed the state science test. Very low scores. And she said, I have a vision. She said, this time we're just going to get, you have participated, a certificate of participation, and maybe next year too, and next year too. But she said, 1 year, we're going to get that certificate to hang on the wall, and it's going to say honorable mention. Hopefully the next year it will say 5th place. In other words, she had a vision and she was building, but I needed to investigate more. You can't jump to your first conclusion, even though I had the expertise to say, those high school science projects are not up to par. So that was one of my experiences in a large city in one of these states. Here again, you have to ask more questions. You have to go, everybody knows the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, why. Sometimes people add how to that. But there's also the 5 whys. When you take that why and you drill down and you say, why is this happening? And when you get the answer, you say, okay, why is that true? And when you get that answer, you keep going down. You keep going down to get to the fundamental reason that you're seeing something. And before you write something, you have to do that drilling down, because you jump to conclusions. Okay, on to Tunica. As I showed you on the map, Tunica is a county in the northwest part of Mississippi. This was a funded project by the U.S. Department of Labor, where they wanted us to go in and document what was happening. This is an area where, for decades back, nothing but agriculture happened. That was the only way of living. And now the town was being developed in other ways. So we set out our plan to go and document what was happening in this town. Department of Labor was especially interested in youth. How were the youth, what were they doing now that their grandfathers and fathers had always done farming? The farms were going away because agribusiness was taking over all the small farms. What were they doing and what were their needs? So we went in with our plan, our methodology, thought it was great. This is a town where Up until the 1980s, there was no sanitation in houses. This is called sugar ditch. And Levon, you have two things to put in chat about this. This is what it looked like before the 1980s. Sewage from the houses fed into this ditch, kitchen and bathroom sewage fed into this ditch, and the ditch was opened. Certainly a lack of justice for people all the way until the 1980s. You can see someone kind of cleaning it out. Levon is putting in the chat the links. I can't talk about all of this, but this is what Tunica, Mississippi looked like up until the 80s when they finally got sewage pipes, and each house could then, their waste could go into the sewer. Okay. When I got there in the 80s to 90s, a lot of the houses looked like this. There were some brick houses, but a lot of them looked this way. So still not very good. Now, reading the documents is important because we read the documents before we did this study, we read the documents that said the state of Mississippi has allowed casino owners to put casinos up and down the Mississippi River. And as you probably know, that river forms the western boundary of Mississippi. And there were casinos, so they started building casinos. Well, in doing research, there's something called an intervening variable. Something that after you make your plan, you think you know what you're doing, it just comes in and it trashes your whole methodology. And that's what happened with these casinos. So Tunica, Mississippi went from this kind of housing with a few bricks housing to a few miles down the road, it looked like this. So our study, the way we were going to do it turned out different. People who had never been in anything but farming before had jobs. Now everybody here in the audience can tell that those people, the poor people from Tunica, got the job sweeping the floors and flipping the hamburgers. And the casino owners pulled in people from Las Vegas and Atlantic City to get the good paying jobs, dealers, that sort of thing. So that was kind of a mess. And when we asked, did focus groups with students, they said before the coming of casinos, there was nothing to do. We could paint somebody's fence or help somebody out, but that was the only kind of jobs we could do. With the coming of the casinos, everybody has jobs. The problem was there was no social development. And so when we went back a few times, they had worked at 3 of the casinos because they got fired at one and then went to another and fired at another and went to another. So we needed to write this so that Department of Labor would understand that there was a whole new ball game there and they needed to rethink what they would do there. The people were dropping out of school, high school certainly, some even middle school because they lied about their age so they can get a job at the casino. For the first time in a lot of those households, 3 adults and a kid were all working. Didn't see a lot of social workers coming in to help them. There wasn't even infrastructural planning because you would ride down the main road from Memphis. You saw how close this was to Memphis and Little Rock. You'd be riding a big bus bringing people to the casinos, and then a tractor would be going 30 miles an hour, and it was a narrow road, so they'd have to go. So there wasn't much planning. The casinos just came in and knocked out everything. And so what we tried to do first was to ask the Department of Labor, how can you change your funding so that some social development could be done? They could learn some social skills in getting jobs and keeping jobs. But it was federal funds, like an act of Congress, to to get that change. So we said, what can be done with the funds that are coming for the casinos? Because of course the casinos money flows through the state government, supposedly to the local school district. And so our recommendations in there were trying to get them to understand that there was a whole new ball game. Now in writing, sometimes you have to be very demanding. And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples where our writing was demanding. You have to be strongly demanding, but you can't be so strong that you lose your relationship with your funding or local people. One demand we made was that there has to be some reciprocity between the casinos and the schools. This is Tunica Middle School. People were just dropping out of school like crazy. They had to be dropout prevention. They needed, our recommendation was that they had to have some kind of way for the schools and the casinos to work together so that they weren't going to quit their jobs in the casinos. So the schools could work together with the casinos. So maybe they could go a few hours a day to school, get their education, and then work in the casinos. So we made that strong demand. Another demand we made that we wrote up in language that we hoped would be acceptable was that there was no algebra teacher in this county school district. We absolutely demanded that the monies be used for an algebra teacher. At least 2 cohorts of students were totally disenfranchised because what if you try to apply to college and the college admissions looks at your transcript and there's no algebra? At that time, and I think up until now, you have to have 2 years of algebra, but they couldn't keep algebra teachers. So that was the other demand that we wrote very strongly, the demand that use the funds from the casinos to hire an algebra teacher. Well, I'm not sure how all of it worked out, but after we were there, I had a conference in Memphis, and I went to Tunica, of course. I drove to Tunica. Still no algebra teacher. So I asked what happened. They hired one and it didn't work out. They managed to get 2 people from Teach for America, who were math specialists, but they didn't trust them because one grew up in Maine and one grew up in Virginia. And what they told me was, how do they know anything about our children? So there are real cultural, regional differences going on there. One thing they did tell me after that year when I went back was that we used the money to get cameras on our school buses and hire monitors, so now we know who's misbehaving. So here again, my values of what needed to be done and their values were a little different, but I think I wrote it up with the kind of demands that needed to be written. So sometimes you need to be strong in your writing to get more justice for people. Sometimes it's easy, like it was with the guinea worm. It was so easy because that was nobody could argue with that needed to be done. And sometimes it doesn't get done, like it didn't get done in Tunica. Let's see, where am I in my time? Yvonne?
You're good for your wrap up. You said you were going to wrap up shortly. That sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. So let's go over, okay, this is one more demand situation. This is back in West Africa, Togo. This was a project, I was hired by the Centers for Disease Control to look at villages in northern Togo, and they were thinking about putting health clinics. The CDC puts health clinics around the world. And I was to look at villages and do focus groups with women and their children, especially about how they treated diseases when their babies and young children had them. So we sent out scouts to the villages to say we were coming to do focus groups, and we went to this village. One of the villages at the bottom of a mountain that had very healthy mothers and babies. They all came. Some of them had vaccination cards, just like we got the COVID vaccinations with what vaccinations. Really looking good, and I could report that I could write it up as a positive step. They were well served. Okay. Now, we had 3 villages to do at the top of the mountain, and yes, that is me. We had to climb this mountain. You can see from the background how high the mountains were, but we had to do the villages at the top of the mountain. And so we walked up. It was a little more than an hour walk up to the top. And when we got to the top, we saw almost nothing, almost nobody. I don't know if the scout didn't tell them we were coming, but they weren't served. No one knew about health care. No one knew about vaccinations for children. You can see a couple of children on the left there, and it wasn't served. So this was another demanding write-up that I did. The villages at the top of the mountain are not being served. I walked up well into my 40s in a skirt, because you're better respected in skirts, so I wore a skirt, and nobody knew no vaccinations, nothing. I wrote in the job description for the people who were going to work in the health clinics, there has to be a line about physicality. Do not hire anybody who is not going to walk up the mountain. How can you have villages at the bottom being served and villages at the top? No justice. So that was another demanding write-up that I did. Injustice to the people at the top of the mountain. Okay, these were the considerations that I took in writing up these issues, considering the culture. Sometimes you have to protect people's privacy, like that school that had those difficult time in the science projects. Your funding priorities. If you're being funded by someone, you have to think of what will they do? What do they want? Some topics are very sensitive, certainly like abortion, very sensitive, that you might have to not include what people say and who said it. Mindful of the local beliefs, the biases, but your own biases too. So the tools I've done, read the documents, map out the community, participate in the community. Whoops. Do shadowing. Shadow people to see what's really going on with justice or injustice. Do case studies, interviews, and focus group. Observe, listen, report. Plant seeds of justice, like the seeds I told you about. Make demands sometimes. You have to make demands. And last one is use the 5 W's. Who, what, where, when, why, sometimes how. And then when you get to the why, drill down, ask why. That's one of the things Levon is putting in the chat. How to use the 5 whys. And that's it for now.